Hello guys, welcome back. My name is Nathan, and today we're going to be discussing one trade candidate from every single NHL team for this upcoming NHL offseason. Now I say upcoming, it's pretty much here, baby. We got so much to talk about in terms of potential trades that could be going down very soon. But who do I see being the most likely guy to be traded from your favorite team this offseason, and what are the big trade candidates from every single NHL team right now in hockey? Watch till the end for all of the picks, all the potential trade talk, and make sure you hit that subscribe button if you're new. 60% of the people watching are not subscribed. If you like trade talk, ranking talk, and hockey talk, this channel is the place to be. Now, to start out today's video, we're going to start out the Buffalo Sabres. Basically, we're going to go for the worst team to the best team later on in the video and go through, again, every team's one trade candidate at the very least this offseason that could be moved to a different team. We're going to start out with Buffalo, and obviously the main one here, I mean, I could go out here and say the obvious and Jack Eichel, and oh, he's going to get traded, but that's too easy. For my trade candidate for Buffalo, I think they will go, and once again, as well as trading Jack Eichel, they'll trade defenseman Rasmus Ristolainen. We've been talking about this for like 3 years. Oh, is Buffalo going to trade Ristolainen? I think it'll actually be the season that it does happen. With some new management in Buffalo, I think they'll actually get it done. I think Ristolainen's time in Buffalo should finally be over. It's about time that experiment ended. But we're now going to move on to the Anaheim Ducks, a team that has a lot more of an interesting landscape in terms of who they could end up trading this offseason. And I do think for Anaheim, Sam Steele makes a lot of sense for them. Now, he is on the younger side of things, and you might say, hey, why would a rebuilding team do that? I still think Sam Steele is a player that with Anaheim's current landscape doesn't really fit for the future, and I think they've given him enough chances and might have moved on from him already. He's 23 years old and could be a guy that could just end up exposing in the expansion draft, honestly, at this rate. He just really hasn't developed into an NHL player yet. He lacks patience. The turnover rate is just egregious, but he's a player that still has some notable skill and still could become a middle six guy. It's just I don't see it really happening in Anaheim. I do see a trade happening this offseason and Anaheim moving away from him. Now we're going to move on to the New Jersey Devils, and I do see New Jersey getting rid of top six winger Andreas Johnsson. Now, Johnsson might be a wild card. He didn't really have the greatest first season in New Jersey, but maybe they keep him around because of that and maybe get some of his trade value higher instead of right now where it's pretty much at an all-time low. But I do think for Johnsson, there could be a potential Vince Dunn trade perhaps where maybe St. Louis brings on Johnsson, who could have a rebound year there. They're looking for wingers. They're looking for left-wing guys, which is what Johnsson could be for them. And Vince Dunn could be a great addition to a New Jersey blue line that is lacking some identity, lacking some players right now, and Vince Dunn could be a pretty big part of that future too, still at age 24. So we'll see what happens, but I think Johnsson is the most likely guy. Then we have from the Columbus Blue Jackets, obviously Seth Jones. At this point, it's pretty much written on the wall that he will go to the Chicago Blackhawks, pretty much go with his brother in Caleb Jones, and honestly at this point, I think it just makes way too much sense to not happen. And now moving on to the Detroit Red Wings and their one trade candidate for this offseason, I'm actually going to go with winger Tyler Bertuzzi, who's found himself in a bunch of different trade rumors during these last couple of weeks. He's been linked to teams like Toronto, and that could be the case, but I do think Tyler Bertuzzi will likely be a guy that the Detroit Red Wings move on from. If I had to guess anybody, Detroit's a pretty hard team to actually know who they'll trade this offseason, if anybody, but I think Bertuzzi does make some sense. I think there's a lot of teams that could go after that. Maybe even Toronto tries to get a replacement in Bertuzzi as well, but I think Detroit definitely has a lot of options, and Bertuzzi might be the guy that goes away. Now we're going to move on to San Jose, and I do think the one player that is potentially on his way out for San Jose would actually be a pretty big one, and I think they would maybe go away with Kevin Labanc on their wings. Now, there's been a lot of trade rumors recently about Labanc potentially going away from San Jose this next offseason. He will be making, I think, $4.7 million for the next 3 seasons, and that's a guy that San Jose has had a weird relationship with. He signed that weird one-year deal, which looked stupid at the time, and then he had a terrible season, and now his future is kind of in question. I think there's a lot of teams out there that would love to have him. I mean, teams at this point like Boston, Winnipeg, St. Louis, there'd be a lot of suitors for a guy that can score at a consistent rate like Labanc can. Now we're going to move on to the LA Kings, though, and a player that I think will be a trade candidate this offseason will actually be Dustin Brown. Now, LA is another hard team to kind of guess who they'll trade because it seems like they're kind of buyers at this point, but Dustin Brown could be an interesting piece to maybe get a younger player in exchange, but Dustin Brown, I still think has value. Had a pretty solid year this past year, over 30 points in around 49 games played. I think for a contending team that could use a middle six guy, Brown is certainly a solid option with 1 year left. Now we're going to move on to the Vancouver Canucks, and their one trade candidate, obviously at this point, has to be Nate Schmidt, a guy that has re-emerged himself in trade rumors these past couple of weeks, seemingly out of nowhere. It's crazy that Vancouver wants to trade a guy like Nate Schmidt, and I'll say he didn't have the greatest first year in Vancouver. It was not productive, not consistent, but I think there is still potential for Nate Schmidt to just be a top 4 D-man on that team, but it seems like they've already moved on. There will be a lot of teams that will want a guy like Nate Schmidt. I mean, what comes to mind right now, New Jersey, Chicago, LA, there's a lot of teams out there that would want to get a guy like Schmidt on their top 4. But now we're going to move on to the Ottawa Senators, and you might say they might trade maybe an older player. I don't actually think so. I think they'll actually trade a prospect perhaps in exchange for maybe a top 6 centerman or a top 4 D-man. And I think one of the big prospects maybe involved in the trade like that would actually be their second rounder from last year in Robbie Järventie. Now, Järventie had a really frustrating and inconsistent year this last year. Wasn't great in the World Juniors, wasn't even that great in Finland, and lacked kind of the explosivity I saw in his draft year. And although it is still it's still very early to give up on a guy like that, I still think he might be one of the pieces involved in maybe a trade to get Ottawa some better assets right now. I feel like Ottawa wants to compete a little bit this next year, and they could be a team that could make the playoffs with an extra boost, and Järventie could be a part of that. But now we're going to move on to the next team here and move on to the Arizona Coyotes. At this point, the big one on the market seems to be Connor Garland, a top 6 winger that continues to fly under the radar pretty much because he plays in Arizona. I mean, it's a stereotype, but if he was playing in Toronto, if he was playing in Montreal, he'd be a lot more highly regarded. He has a pretty solid deal, is a great goal scorer, great tenacity player too, and I do think has a great edge to him. I think there'll be a ton of teams out there for him, and he could probably get at least a first-round pick on this market. I mean, a team like Boston just makes so much sense. Now we're going to move on to the Chicago Blackhawks, and I know I've been talking about this team this player as a potential trade option for years now, but I think this is once again, kind of like the Ristolainen situation. Finally, the year the trade does happen, and I think Dylan Strome will be on a different team next year. I think Dylan Strome is kind of checked out from the Chicago Blackhawks. I don't really know what's going on there either, because in his first year coming from Arizona, he was great with guys like DeBrincat, but it just seemed to kind of fizzle out after that situation. His opportunities and chemistry started to fizzle out as well. It seems like he's just emotionally out of Chicago, and I think a trade is pretty much inevitable at this point. Now we're going to move on to the Calgary Flames, and another guy that could be on his way out as well this offseason, and could be out of his way pretty soon too. I'm going to move on to the Calgary Flames, and I'm going to go to franchise defenseman Mark Giordano. Now, he only has 1 year left, and he obviously is past his prime right now. Had that great Norris Trophy year a couple years back, but he's declined pretty sharply ever since then, especially this past year where defensively it was just hard to watch at times. I mean, Calgary is a team that's kind of going in a more younger direction, and I think Giordano could be a good piece to potentially get some leverage. I mean, he could be exposed in the Seattle Kraken draft anyway, so we could see him moved pretty soon. But now we're going to move on to the Philadelphia Flyers. My pick for them is going to be Jacob Voracek, a guy that could just be exposed in the Seattle expansion draft just like Mark Giordano, but I think Philadelphia could maybe get some assets for him in the right situation. I mean, hey, if Duncan Keith gets Jones and a third, I think Voracek could still get something, but he makes upwards of $8.2 million, which is still a lot, but he is still a very productive top 6 guy. It's just that in Philadelphia, the cap space is too much, and they don't really have a need for him quite anymore. Now we're going to move on to my favorite team, the Dallas Stars, and a guy that I do actually see them moving on from, sadly, is Anton Khudobin. He makes $3.3 million for the next 2 seasons, and he's a backup that I think could get some pretty big leverage this offseason, especially if Ben Bishop is going to be ready for next year. It doesn't really make sense to keep him, Khudobin, and Jake Onger, and I doubt Ben Bishop has much value left in this market with his current health situation, so I think they're going to basically just go all in Jake Onger, leave maybe Anton Khudobin left in the expansion draft, but if they can make a trade happen before that, I think they will. Now we're going to move on to the New York Rangers, another team that has a lot of potential moves to make this offseason, but a guy I do think they will move on from is forward Pavel Buchnvich. Now, it will be very sad to see him go away, but I do think in a potential Jack Eichel trade, Buchnvich just makes way too much sense to get rid of. It'd probably be Buchnvich, Strome, a great prospect, a first-round pick to start out there, and I think that makes a lot of sense for New York, but Buchnvich is a guy that likely will be on his way out, which just sucks for New York, but if it is for Jack Eichel, I think that makes the pain a lot less personally. Now we're going to move on to the St. Louis Blues, and this is another easy one. The one trade candidate they have this offseason, or at least one of multiple, but the big one is obviously Vladimir Tarasenko. A lot of teams could be in on him. They're likely going to retain some salary, but they still want to compete. But Tarasenko seems on his way out, disgruntled with that team and that organization. St. Louis doesn't have a lot of leverage left, but I do think an offseason trade will still happen, probably in the next couple of weeks. But now we're going to move on to the Winnipeg Jets, another team that I think will trade an or a prospect, or potentially have the big trade piece of the offseason being a prospect. I think the prospect that will get traded this offseason will actually be Christian Vesalainen. I think there's a lot of room for Winnipeg to improve. They still have some cap space for this next year, and Vesalainen is a guy that has aged considerably since those great KHL and Liga seasons, and I do think for Vesalainen, even though there is still potential to be a top middle six guy perhaps, I think he will probably move on from the Winnipeg organization, and I think a trade could be in the works for potentially maybe like a top middle six center or a top 4 D-man with Vesalainen plus another asset, or maybe like a first round pick perhaps. There's some options for Winnipeg, but I do still think they want to compete as much as humanly possible now, and trading a guy like Vesalainen for some immediate help would definitely work out short term. Now we're going to move on to the next team though, and the Nashville Predators, and their one trade piece, and I think they'll want to trade him before they trade him on the next year, will actually be Philip Forsberg. I think Nashville is going to go in this more rebuilding, retooling route, and Forsberg getting traded, I think, is just almost inevitable at this point. If not this offseason, it will happen during the season next year. I just don't see him staying in Nashville. I mean, out of the Victor Arvidsson trade, you saw on Philip Forsberg's story just a big thumbs down emoji. I think that just signals what Forsberg is feeling about Nashville right now, and I think he'll eventually want his way out. So might as well trade him while you can still get something for him. But now we're going to move on at the next spot here with the Edmonton Oilers. This could be a player that they could just flat out buy out if they don't have any trades, and I think they might have to get creative, which for Ken Holland is an absolute struggle, but I do think at some point Mikko Koskinen will be on a different team next year. Again, it probably will be a buyout because Edmonton just can't do anything creative. Why not, hey, just get rid of the Koskinen contract, maybe give up Caleb Jones that way. Just a thought, Ken Holland, but I guess not. Anyways, I think Koskinen will be gone. That $4.5 million contract is just not good whatsoever. And at this point, I think it will be a big one, a big priority for Edmonton to get that off the books, especially before the Seattle expansion draft. Now we're going to move on to the next team in the Boston Bruins. Another pretty obvious one here, I think, comes in Jake DeBrusk, a guy that also has kind of had his way out with Boston these past couple of years. A great playoff player, but just isn't really a consistent everyday guy for them. But I still think Pat can have a lot of value on the market, and a lot of teams would like to have the services of a 24-year-old guy who's already proven himself in the playoffs, but just needs that extra push. Now, there's teams like Edmonton, obviously, that would fit. Teams like Toronto, maybe LA, that could be there, but a lot of options potentially for the young forward. Now, we're going to move on to the next team, though, and the Minnesota Wild. And the more I think about this situation, the more I think the Minnesota Wild will trade Matthew Dumba before the expansion draft. At this point, I mean, I doubt they want to lose a guy like Carson Soucy, who has had such a great career so far in Minnesota and has a lot more cost control than Matt Dumba at this point. He's a guy that they might just trade eventually, and I think just might rip off the Band-Aid this offseason. But I think before Seattle, before they have to actually protect him, Matthew Dumba could be on his way out there, and his $6 million could be freed up for maybe a top 6 center that they would want to go for this offseason. Now we're going to move on to the next team, though, and move on to the Washington Capitals, and this is also another super easy one in Evgeny Kuznetsov. I mean, who knows? It's been rumored maybe Jack Eichel could be on his way to Washington if we see like a Kuznetsov deal there. I doubt Buffalo would want to do that just because Kuznetsov doesn't really have too much value there, but I still think there's a lot of potential possibilities for Kuznetsov, a guy that at his peak can still be a great top 6 playoff center, and it just seems like, again, kind of like Tarasenko, where his current team is just not really gelling with him anymore, and he wants to go to a whole new change of scenery, which I think for Evgeny Kuznetsov could be very, very good for his career. But now we're going to move on to the next team, and we'll go on to the Toronto Maple Leafs, another team that I think will trade a prospect this offseason, and that guy will unfortunately be defenseman Timothy Liljegren. It's really hard to pinpoint Liljegren's value at this point, but I do think for Toronto, if they want to get creative, Liljegren might be the guy to get rid of. He's not really made any huge steps these past couple of years in the AHL, and he's a guy that, although still has potential, I think, hasn't really grown into an NHL pedigree player. There is still potential there, obviously, but I think he could be in a move maybe to get a potentially middle 6 guy and get some cost control there. I mean, hey, if they want to go after a guy like Connor Garland, a potential Garland and maybe Liljegren plus type trade could work there perhaps. Now we're going to move on to the next team though, in the Pittsburgh Penguins. Again, another guy that I think could also be gone in the Seattle expansion draft, but Pittsburgh might want to get ahead of the curve there. And I have at this spot right now, Jason Zucker. He makes $5.5 million for this year and next. And honestly, at this point, with that whole experiment, it just seems to have been a complete fail on Pittsburgh's side. I just don't see them keeping him at this point. He wasn't great in the playoffs, wasn't great in the regular season, was kind of just there. And I think Zucker can be better than that for sure. And hey, if Vegas goes after Jack Eichel and they want to get some more forward help potentially, maybe there's a potential swap of maybe Riley Smith and Jason Zucker. Potentially a thought there, but I think there's a lot of fits for a guy that can still be a productive top 6 guy. Now we're going to move on to the Florida Panthers though, and this is another kind of Koskinen situation where if they can't find a trade, they'll probably buy him out. But I think getting the Anton Stralman contract off the books should be one of the number one priorities for the Florida Panthers. He makes more than $5 million, is just an absolute tank of a player at this point in the wrong ways. He does bring some great leadership, but he is just a shell of what he once was, is not an NHL player at this point. I think getting that contract off the books any way possible is vastly important. Now we're going to move on to the Carolina Hurricanes, and another contract that I think could be off the books this offseason. We're now going to move on to Swiss winger Nino Niederreiter. Now I do think Carolina can make some pretty big moves this offseason, but Niederreiter kind of seems like another player that kind of is on his way out. During the playoffs was a non-factor, during a lot of the regular season was kind of looked a little bit lost on that Carolina forward group. I think that's a guy that could go off the team. You could maybe get like a first round pick for him perhaps. You get rid of $5 million and add some big free space there. Maybe you go after Vladimir Tarasenko instead and get that spot alleviated with. But I think there's a lot that Carolina can do, and Niederreiter will likely be another guy that is on a different team next year. And next up, we're going to go to the Colorado Avalanche, a team that also has a lot of moves to make this year, and a guy that I think they'll have to get rid of this year as well is JT Compher, a guy who makes $3.5 million for this year and next, and in terms of that bottom 6 center role, hasn't really fit into it as cleanly as Colorado would have liked. I mean, that's a guy that if you're looking for a third line center, Vancouver's looking for a third line center, maybe New York is looking for the third line center, could work out decently there in a whole new fresh start, but obviously Colorado just doesn't seem to have much of a fit or nor the opportunity. I think that contract will definitely be huge for Colorado to get rid of. Next up, though, we're going to go to the New York Islanders. Another contract that will pretty much have to be moved this offseason. I think from New York, it'll be Nick Leddy on that defense. $5.5 million for this year, and then he'll be a UFA. But I think New York will want to get ahead of the curve there and get rid of his contract as soon as possible. They don't really have any cap space, but Nick Leddy would certainly make it a little bit more flexible. And maybe they could go after a guy like a Tarasenko if they do get rid of Leddy. Another guy that could be maybe available in the Seattle expansion draft, but I think New York will want to test their options to get at least an asset back for him. Now we're going to go on to the Vegas Golden Knights, and this is one of my hotter takes, I think, this offseason. But with Vegas wanting to get some new guys, they'll have to have some cap space, and potentially Robin Lehner could be a part of one of those deals. He makes $5 million for the next 4 seasons, and having $12 million locked up in Florian Lehner is not great when you're really only using one of them purely as a starter. I think Lehner could be on a new team as well. Vegas wants to really shake it up this offseason. Now we're going to move on to the Montreal Canadiens, and my next pick here is going to be pretty obvious. It's probably going to be Jonathan Drouin. I mean, at this point, he makes $5.5 million. When he is healthy, when he is ready to go, is a pretty great scorer, but it seems like he just cannot handle that Montreal pressure. It seems like that might be the cause of his leave from Montreal. And if it is the case, I think Montreal should do best by him and let him go to a different team. Who knows what that team would be, but I still think there's some assets you can get back for a guy that can score, win healthy, and looks to be healthy physically. So I think there's a lot of teams out there that would like to get a guy like that, and that cap space for Montreal will be hugely important in re-signing guys like Phil Deneau. But now we're going to go to the last team to talk about today in the Tampa Bay Lightning, and the most likely trade candidate for them, obviously, is Tyler Johnson, a guy that also could be exposed in the expansion draft for Seattle. But I do think, just like a lot of other teams, they'll try to get rid of that contract and maybe get an asset back before that happens. But he had a great playoffs, was a huge part of that Tampa win. He makes $5 million, which will still hurt for a new team getting him back. But I think he made a lot more value for himself, and Tampa could still get something back for him, which would be pretty crazy, especially with how that situation with Johnson was looking just a year ago. He's a pretty solid player, though, right now, and could add to a team's top 6, especially if it is Seattle. But that'll be it for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. Comment down below, what do you guys think about my picks? What do you agree and disagree with? And who do you see being the trade candidate from your favorite NHL team? Make sure you share this video with your friends, get it out there, and click on this card for all of my hockey predictions and picks videos right on one playlist. I love y'all. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.